Pleasure.
Can we turn this off?
Yeah. Can you switch off this, please? Thank you. Can you switch off the power? Great pleasure to welcome Sanjay Reddy. Sanjay is one of those very few people, perhaps the only one in the world, who I consider to be both more than 10 years younger than me, and cleverer than me, and wiser than me. All three, you see. A lot of people are very cleverer, but wiser, that's very, very few. So, and I generally seek his guidance on all manner of matters, and you will see soon why. Sanjay, thanks for coming.
Thank you for that overly generous introduction. I can only surmise that it's because I claimed for myself the status of a FOA, or Friend of Akbar, on the first day of this workshop, that Akbar feels the need to repay in the same coin. But thank you very much for being here, and I'm very honored and pleased to be present here. I think this is is this the second or the third time I've done this? The second.
No, second time in Bangalore.
In
You've
Bangalore.
done it in Manchester also.
That's right. That's right.
This is your fourth time over.
Fourth time, depending on which avatar or incarnation of this workshop one counts. And it's always been a pleasure to do so because of the lively and serious participants in these workshops. One of the things, however, I have begun to do in each subsequent round is to speak in a more off-the-cuff and informal manner with less preparation. And I don't know if that's good or bad. I won't say I've learned to do that, but I've begun to do that. And today is certainly the day that I at least prepared by way of a formal presentation. But maybe that's for the best, because what I intend to do is to, if it's all right with you, just present some of my own reflections about the field of development studies, if it is a field, and hope that we can then engage in a conversation about what this field is, well, what it was, what it is, and what it could be. And I do so, or would like to do so, in the spirit of really sharing with you and asking you to share with me the personal predicament which one finds oneself in trying to understand how to comport oneself, or how to situate oneself in a discipline of this sort, and how to think about what the discipline is. The title that was in the workshop, that is in the workshop agenda, which I just saw, is Whither Development Studies. And this is very amusing to me because I actually rather like the title, which was assigned to me, of Whither Development Studies. But I had originally proposed to the organizers of the workshop the title Development Studies, Which Way Now? And Development Studies, Which Way Now, some of you may recognize as a play on a famous essay by Amartya Sen called Development, Which Way Now, which he published in, I think, the Oxford Bulletin of Economics and Statistics in 1984, I believe, or thereabouts, which was one of the first places that Amartya Sen made the case that there were a number of societies in the world which had made very substantial progress in terms of non-income achievements, which was in many ways out of proportion with their progress in income terms. And in this essay he mentioned the now famous examples of Kerala, Sri Lanka, Cuba, Jamaica, I believe, and so forth, which later on he developed further or paid more attention to in subsequent writings, including at length in his book called Hunger and Public Action, which came out in the late 1980s. And so I thought that in my own small way I would pay homage to Amartya Sen, and of course also take on a smaller topic of development studies rather than development, which is itself, of course, offering quite a large promissory note. But I have now been, I don't know if I should say upgraded or simply had the point of reference or the reference changed for me, because Whither Development Studies evokes, at least for me, Joe Stiglitz's famous book, Whither Socialism, which many of you may be aware of, which is a very important book in which Joe Stiglitz lays out a number of his own reflections about what economic theory does and does not say, as far as what is viable regarding alternative institutional and economic arrangements. And of course, I think I can reveal this to you, even though this is being videotaped. My own view, maybe the view of many other people, is that although that book is very, very insightful, perhaps Professor Stiglitz has not quite answered the question which he laid out in the title. He doesn't tell us his answer as to where socialism is headed, or what kinds of socialist experiments are now possible, leaving that for us to do as an exercise, as they would have said in the old mathematics or science textbooks, for the student to do as an exercise. The master has laid out all the relevant ideas, and the student has to merely answer the question, put the final capstone on it as an exercise, it being implicit, perhaps, what is the general direction to be followed, and the specificities to be answered by the particular individual. Okay, so all this by way of prelude. What is development studies? It's a good question. I don't think that we would have always known or had any natural sense of what should come underneath this heading. Some of you are, of course, familiar, I'm sure, with the literature on the history of the idea of development, of the discourse of development. Sometimes the famous speech of Harry S. Truman in 1948, in which he referred to the commitment of the United States to assist in what he called the economic development of the underdeveloped areas of I think he used the phrase the underdeveloped areas, the progress of the underdeveloped areas of the world, is mentioned as a landmark. But of course, there were earlier references to the concept of development. Joseph Schumpeter famously wrote A Theory of Economic Development, in which, of course, he had ideas about the use of that, about the deployment of that concept, which were perhaps more general than the ideas which subsequently held sway. But the concept of development, I think, on any proper reckoning, is not in the least recent. It's sufficient to read the first books of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations to see that the concept of improvement, as Adam Smith calls it, is really a concept of the historical transformation of societies along a pathway in which they go from being what we would today call perhaps less developed to being more developed. Certainly from being less prosperous to being more prosperous, to having greater means at their disposal, to having greater opulence, to use another word which Adam Smith used and which Amartya Sen has also used recently. Of course, Amartya Sen has used it in a more derisory way to describe the distinction between having means, more means at one's disposal as such, and using those means in a fashion which helps to promote desirable ends. He reserves the concept of opulence for the former rather than for the latter. The idea being that you can live in a very opulent palace, but or have a very opulent treasury, but be in fact otherwise not very well provided for because of bad choices you might have made. So we can go back certainly to Adam Smith and to the entire discourse of classical political economy, looking at concepts such as improvement, which clearly have this historical sense to them, that they involve the historical transformation of societies in order to look for antecedents. And of course, the concept of development also appears in fields other than economics and the social sciences, most especially and interestingly perhaps biology, where the concept of development is referred to the development of the organism, and of course also the development of species over time. And in both of these it has some of the idea which Joseph Schumpeter attached to the term, that development involves structural transformation and not merely growth. So in biology, certainly the idea of the transformation, whether of an organism or of a species over time, in its morphology, in its structure, is very crucial in the concept of development. It's not simply the idea of growth. So it would not be surprising if Joseph Schumpeter had that biological resonance or lineage in mind when he made his own distinction between growth and development. Again, Schumpeter's canvas was wide. He was not interested only in what we call the developing countries, or the underdeveloped areas of the world, as Harry S. Truman said, but much more generally in a distinction which could apply to all societies, including those we now call developed. Of course, the phraseology of Harry S. Truman is very interesting because, among other things, the concept of being underdeveloped seems to have as its counterpart the idea of being developed, which, if you stop and think about it, is a breathtaking idea. What could it possibly mean to be developed? Most of us take it as something that's fairly straightforward, a concept that's fairly straightforward to deploy and to make sense of. But in fact, it's far from obvious what that could possibly mean. I've sometimes asked my students, undergraduate students in the development economics course that I teach, whether they think that the society which they live in is a realized utopia, because that, it would seem, is what is involved. Certainly if you take a fairly demanding idea of what it means to be developed in hand, that's what it would seem to mean to describe a society as being developed, as having done its historical work of achieving or arriving at some end point, some telos, in which nothing more in some fundamental sense is to be done, a kind of end of history, as Francis Fukuyama, following Hegel, would have said, which is not to say that there's nothing more at all to do, but whatever there is to do is by way of, to borrow a musical metaphor, what one might call as pianissimo, small variations, nothing large required to be done. Certainly no fundamental questions required to be addressed. Well, anybody who has been awake for the last 5 years and seen the debates which have emerged in the aftermath of the crash of 2008 is well aware that there are live debates, including in the so-called developed countries, the so-called advanced countries. It's not as if the debates have ended, and in fact, it's not at all obvious that they could ever end. And these are debates about the fundamental rules and organizational and institutional structures, facts in the society. They're not debates merely about the pianissimo. So there is a very serious question as to whether, notwithstanding the ancient provenance, certainly ancient is perhaps too strong a word, the old provenance of the concept of development in the form of the idea of improvement over historical time, as used by the classical political economists, that there may be ways in which we might become prisoners of the language of development, which we should be conscious of and perhaps try to avoid. Ashish Nandi, a famous Indian thinker, for example, has referred in one of his essays to what he calls the concept of the inclined plane of history, the idea that history necessarily goes in one direction, necessarily involves a certain set of changes, necessarily ends in one place. And he's urged that we should combat this idea of the inclined plane of history. A number of other thinkers who have referred to themselves as anti-developmentalists, or whom others have referred to as such, perhaps have, well, speak in a similar spirit, or have argued in a similar vein, that the concept of development in many ways limits our understanding as much as it opens up understanding, or at least there is that danger. Another example of that would be, more specifically, would be the idea of stagism, the notion that countries have to go through, or necessarily have to pass through a certain set of historical stages And of course, there are different versions of this. There's the Marxist version of this, which is known to some of you. There's the more, let us say, neoclassical version of it, the modernization theory version, high modernization theory version associated with people like Walt Whitman, Rostow, and others as well. But in one way or another, the notion that societies must necessarily pass through a certain set of historical stages would be an example of that. That time and again we have found that in fact it's not necessarily the case that societies have to pass through the stages which we imagine they have to pass through. The campus we're sitting in might be an interesting example. Right? This is a monument to the fact that India has succeeded in becoming a world-leading center in one particular sector, at the same time that it languishes very badly in other areas. And that particular disproportionality, the particular pathway that India has followed in this regard, is not something that one would necessarily have anticipated if one had adopted a statist point of view. Indeed, at a conference I attended in Cochin just a few days ago on agrarian studies, I had, again at the spur of the moment, because I was forced to present something, I had looked through some of the data on the structural transformation of societies over time. And one of the very interesting things that one can find, if one does so, I'll be happy to share with you a link through which you can interactively examine the data yourself from the World Bank's World Development Indicators website. What you'll see is a tremendous growth of the services sector in every society in the world. I think much more substantial growth than had been anticipated, even by those people who operated within a rather statist understanding, modernization theoretic understanding perhaps in the past, who did recognize that there would be an increasing role for services, but perhaps not exactly of this kind. In particular, what you have in many societies around the world is that the share of industry in value added has barely increased. There are few societies in which it's increased, many societies in which it's barely increased at all. The share of industry in employment has also not increased at all, in a number of cases decreased. Jose Antonio knows very well the sad story in this regard in different regions of the world, including Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa in certain periods. A very substantial increase in services, contribution to value added, and to employment. And of course, the question arises as to how to make sense of this. And I think if one wants to make sense of this, one has to really look at the empirical pattern of development as it has actually been taking place in the world, and see that the services sector is not one thing. It's a very large aggregate which contains within it many different things. And in particular, it contains within it highly privileged, relatively speaking, privileged sections, such as the IT industry, to which we owe some thanks for being here today. IT-enabled services and so on, typically very globalized parts of the economy, which take advantage of opportunities provided by external trade in services, in particular, and which depend on substantial skill base, but also rather narrow skill base, fairly small number of people who are involved, and therefore generating small islands of prosperity which are not very well tethered to their surroundings. And then on the other hand, you have a very large periphery in some sense, which also comes under the heading of services, which includes all manner of activities, from people who work in tea shops or restaurants, to those who engage in delivery, and so on and so forth. Innumerable activities, many of which seem to have more of the nature of being sinks for what would have been called in the earlier literature surplus labor than they do the feature of being dynamic sectors which are attracting people because of the tremendous increase in opportunities which they represent. So on the one hand, you have genuinely dynamic sectors. On the other hand, you have these other areas which might seem to be more in the nature of reflections of the failure of the economy and the society to generate other kinds of employment opportunities, then they are testaments to its success. Okay, something to be discussed further, of course, and I don't want to dwell on this, but it's an example of how you really need to go beneath the data and look at what is happening today, contemporarily, in individual societies and around the world, to make sense of what's happening. And I would say in some broad perspective, this is evidence as much of what one might call maldevelopment, the failure of development or development taking on a character or a cast which is not entirely attractive, as it is evidence of this of structural transformations which are desirable. I mean, one could read it in different ways, but I would say that the former reading is certainly very compelling. Certainly for societies such as India, which has had basically a very weak record of generating employment and sustaining livelihoods for the mass of people over a considerable time, even as it has had very dramatic success in individual sectors, generating these islands of prosperity. But I would suggest much the same can be seen in many other parts of the world, with some notable exceptions, China being the most obvious case. Even in China, by the way, parenthetically, the amount of manufacturing employment and even manufacturing share of value added has barely increased over a 40-year period. Of course, part of that was because of China's heavy industrialization under its planned economy earlier, at a very early stage, perhaps out of keeping with its otherwise agrarian character and the character of other societies at a similar level of income. But part of that is really because even in China, some of the same phenomena are actually taking place as are observed elsewhere. I think these a prioristic notions, the idea that ideas we might have in advance as to what are the historical stages through which countries might pass, societies might pass, and indeed lots of other a prioristic ideas have to go out the window. And therefore, in some sense, the most fundamental point, which is a very obvious point, is that development has to be an empirical subject. It is not a theoretical subject, it's an empirical subject. This does not mean that one needs or indeed ought to apply randomized trials or any other such technique as the privileged form of empiricism. Indeed, I will argue against that if I have occasion to do that in my main remarks or in the discussion. But it is an empirical subject. Let me just give you an example, a snippet. I just came from a village a few hours away from here. I spent the last few days there. I was born in the city, in Bangalore. My father's village is a few hours away in Andhra Pradesh, and I was there from Sunday through yesterday evening, 3-4 days. And I learned a few things there, as I always learn when I go there, just by listening to people. Here's an example. What do you think happens when, well, let me put the question to you as follows. What do you think is the connection between, well, or the impact of rising labor costs and increasing scarcity of labor of certain kinds on the choice of agricultural techniques? And here I want to give you a very specific example of that, on the prevalence in particular of coconut palms, and particular kind of coconut palms which people used to grow traditionally, namely the tall coconut palms, which are very nice to look at, which have coconuts growing in the at the top. What do you think would be the possible impact of increasing labor costs and increasing scarcity of specialized kinds of labor? I won't say more, I'll give away the whole story right now. On the propensity of farmers to maintain trees of this variety.
You don't have people to pluck those, hence you tend to grow shorter ones.
Exactly. So here we have a highly empirical piece of reasoning which has just been engaged in. Exactly so. So this is an example of what Marxists would have called the relations of production, having a determinative influence. It's actually not just that that labor is more expensive, though that's a very important factor. It's also that the workers who used to climb the trees to get the coconuts, bring them down at the appropriate time, no longer wish to do that, or their children don't wish to do that, because it is viewed now as a job which is somewhat stigmatized because of its historical associations. They would rather move into other things. There's been a generalized push for education, in particular the kinds of schooling which you and I have had, which involve book learning, and the children by and large would rather do things of that nature, which go into professions of one kind or another, very understandably. So the number of people who are available to do this task, both because of the social stigma attached to it and perhaps background factors which are leading to generalized scarcity of labor, is diminished. And the consequence, perhaps not immediately obvious if you were to sit at your desk and guess what the consequence would be, is that people are choosing to plant shorter coconut trees. So I can just put up my hand and pick them off rather than hiring somebody to do this. Very sensible, very rational. I'm not a votary of rational choice theory as the only way to understand the world, but it is a very rational response. And it is not one, I would put to you, which one would necessarily have guessed at a priori. You would have to go to the field, look and see what people are actually doing, listen to them to see that this is what's actually happening. And are those shorter varieties already available? Well, maybe, maybe not. There's also a demand for new varieties, which comes directly from this source. And there are many other examples of this kind which can be multiplied. I don't want to subject you to innumerable anecdotes, but it's an example of that.
Sanjay, do you give us a sense of what's been happening to real wages
Yes.
in your village?
I seem to have lost my, I'm wearing a watch, that's why I've lost it. I just forgot that I was wearing it. Yes, well, this is a very interesting question, because I will treat this as not a side issue, since the master has raised it. There has been a general impression in much of India that, and there's been some discussion in the newspapers and so on, about rising wages in the agricultural sector, and some people have attached that to the impact of the wage guarantee program, the employment guarantee program, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and critics of the program have argued that this is an adverse consequence, which was unanticipated by the framers of the program. And certainly I think it's true that they didn't pay much attention to this issue or viewed it as only a good that wages would increase, but it has had a knock-on implication in terms of the availability of labor for various other tasks, the tendency to use mechanized techniques and so on instead of hiring workers. So there is this general impression. Now, I did hear, when I happened to be in Cochin at this conference on agrarian studies, a very interesting paper by a Japanese researcher who had looked at the official data on wages in different parts of India, and he did find that there had been an increase, but only relative to the wages of 5 to 7 years ago, and he argued that in real terms, wages have just recovered to the level which used to be present about 10 to 15 years ago. So his view was that there has been no real increase in wages, or no increase in wages in real terms, relative to a historical standard. And of course, there are perhaps secular tendencies of other kinds which are at play. Mechanization, for instance, is happening for various reasons, not just the scarcity of labor, but the increasing difficulty in maintaining livestock, which has its own prehistory to it. Nowadays in India, you'll find relatively few livestock in comparison with those with the numbers you would have found before. And this has implications with respect to the necessity to use chemical fertilizers, for instance, rather than organic fertilizers. So there are these secular transformations happening, and there's perhaps the impact of this program. The impression on the ground in this particular area is that wages have increased substantially, and that's had a big impact. Of course, these discourses are highly politicized. When you are talking to a landlord or somebody from that class who would have hired workers at a lower wage earlier, it is perhaps not entirely surprising that this characterization appears in the form of a complaint. On the other hand, it may well also be true that there is some empirical transformation happening of this kind, whether or not it's a bad thing. So I think the record is not entirely obvious. Now in India's case, unlike in China's case, I think it's less easy to argue that whatever wage increase has been experienced in recent years, especially with respect to unskilled labor, is because of arriving at what some people call the kink in the Lewisian labor supply curve. That is to say, the historical point at which labor surplus has in some sense been absorbed or heavily absorbed, so that it now becomes necessary to compete for available workers through wage increases, which it had not previously been necessary to do. In China's case, the enormous absorption of workers into manufacturing, but also into the services sector in urban areas, the greater dynamism of the economy, makes it easier to argue that. And certainly China has experienced wage increases, especially in the coastal areas, but indeed throughout China now, for the last 7 years or so. It has begun to experience wage increases about 7 years ago, and by now they've mounted to, I think, roughly 50% or higher as compared to, in real terms, as compared to the wages before that. And so that story of the exhaustion of labor surplus arriving at the kink in the Lewisian supply curve makes more sense in the Chinese case. It's an important part of the debate in China as well as to what is going on and what implications that has. In India's case, it's hard to argue that it's increasing labor scarcity caused by demand side factors, by the absorption of the labor surplus, I think. And so the emphasis has shifted instead to these other kinds of transformations which are taking place. Does that answer the question?
Very well.
So here is just another, perhaps, illustration of the need to be deeply empiricist. How much time do I have?
You can speak for another 20 minutes, 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Half an hour even.
So this is this is again to say, of course, that empiricism has to be broad-based. It has to involve a wide variety of methodological techniques. Albert Hirschman used to use the phrase the interocular test, which was a fancy way of saying, look and see what's in front of your eyes, and ask, does it make sense? Does it pass the interocular test? Well, I remember when I was a graduate student in economics, probably well, I think it's still true, the phrase anecdotal evidence was used disparagingly by economists in particular to refer to any piece of evidence gathered through observation. Now, why is it that we should be so disparaging about one of the fundamental ways in which we learn and know about the world? Instead, we would rather do a multi-million-dollar randomized trial in one place with the argument that through that we will learn scientifically about the value of a single impact coefficient, which we can then generalize around the world because of the hypothesis that that same impact coefficient is that which prevails everywhere else. That is to say that, for example, if having 2 school teachers rather than 1 in Udaipur has such and such an impact on the test performance of 3rd grade children, then we can be safely assured that the same is true in Uganda. Well, why should the same be true? I leave that, I bracket that question, I simply raise it for you. Why should the same be true? But the notion is that, the notion which has become prevalent is that this is the only way of understanding the world which makes sense. Well, I wouldn't have learned about the propensity to adopt shorter coconut trees if I had relied on a randomized trial in order to learn about that, right? And there are many, many such examples, of course. This brings me to a second theme, which is the question of whether it makes sense to study development as if it can be parceled out into individual disciplinary pieces. Development economics, sociology of development, politics of development, agronomy, and so on and so forth. I think that anybody who's had any serious engagement with any type of real development issue, certainly with a practical orientation, and development is a practical discipline, and that is no embarrassment, despite what the disciplinary czars will tell you. In fact, it's a great challenge, not an embarrassment. Anybody who's had any serious engagement with development as a practical discipline in any type of applied context knows that it makes no sense to privilege the creation of knowledge within specified boundaries of that knowledge, because it will at most help you to understand a very small piece of a larger puzzle. Right? And there are, of course, cases which are very obvious of this kind. There are cases which are less obvious. To take an example of a case which is very obvious, again, I'll mention one from the dryland areas of central India, which I happen to have visited in the last few days, but it's present all over the world. If you want to understand why water is increasingly scarce, why there's depletion of groundwater, and indeed water needed for agricultural purposes, you have to understand the institutional arrangements, you have to understand the political context, you have to understand the historical context, you have to understand the social norms. You cannot approach this, one cannot approach this as a narrow economic question. This is something which, of course, Elinor Ostrom in her way pointed to, but we didn't need Elinor Ostrom to do that. Robert Wade, many years ago, wrote a famous book in development studies about problems of water management in Kurnool district in Andhra Pradesh, not very far from here. And that was another example of that kind of engagement. Anybody who's worked on the water issue knows this. There is, of course, the aspect of a multi-person prisoner's dilemma, collective action problem, and so on. You can put it in those terms if you like. It gives insight. But in order to really understand what's going on, you have to also look at all this. Look at this conjunction of factors. Because to sustainably use water, and as importantly, to put in place institutional arrangements which ensure that that limited water which is available is accumulated and safeguarded in the best possible way, requires collective action, which in turn is underpinned by these social political institutions and norms. And there's a particular historical story about that in each individual case. I'd be happy to talk about it if you would like, but there's a very interesting historical story about that in this case, as there is in other cases, and about the functioning of these kinds of collective systems in the past, which have broken down and which are only being partially supplanted by the efforts which are now taking place, whether spearheaded by government or by NGOs or by others. So you have a picture which is very context specific, and which you need to have a deep engagement with the place in order to understand. It has historical dimensions, it has social cultural dimensions, it has political, institutional, and legal dimensions, as well as economic ones. So you have this type of interpenetration of factors. This makes for what some people have called, in recent social science literature, I'll mention the phrase even though I'm not sure I fully subscribe to this, the fact that this problem, as many other problems in development are what they call wicked problems. This is actually a phrase which originates in the urban planning literature from the early 1970s. A wicked problem is a problem which doesn't have a single test as to whether or not it's solved, because there are multiple dimensions according to which success has to be assessed or failure will be assessed. And also one in which there are deep causal interconnections between the different factors, so that the idea of having a analytical solution or an algorithmic method for arriving at a conclusion as to what to do becomes a fool's errand. You have to engage in a deep-seated empirical investigation, as well as draw on relevant theoretical and conceptual tools in order to make sense of this. So I would submit to you, using this neologism, that a lot of the problems in development are of this nature. And this is one of the reasons that participatory institutional modalities are attractive in development. One of the reasons. Because they offer a more open-ended way of dealing with some of this wickedness. But of course, the point is even more simple than this. When I wake up in the morning and I brush my teeth or I have breakfast, I'm not engaging in, or for that matter, come here to give a lecture, I'm not engaging in an act which can be parceled out as an economic act, a political act, a cultural act. There are aspects of all of these which make sense of my agency and of the institutional structures within which I'm operating and so on. And I think this is a general point about social science. I will not push that further because some of you may be wedded to your particular disciplinary locations to a greater extent than would permit you to go all the way with me here. But I want to suggest to you that the different disciplines are merely what one might call distillations that involve our own conceptual efforts to make sense of the world very partially, and that the integrated reality of our lives can never be done justice by these kinds of distillations, much as we may make academic careers out of them. And of course, it's not just development studies, but environmental studies, many other disciplines, public policy analysis generally, which are of this kind. Interestingly, they all get treated as low-status disciplines in the disciplinary hierarchy of the university because they're applied. Whereas in fact, we should think of them as involving a very high order of demand, intellectual demand upon us, precisely because integration of different forms of knowledge is necessary in order to make any kind of real progress. Third theme I would like to introduce, which is linked to what I've said already, of course, is to draw your attention to the false attractions of technocracy and technocratic ways of understanding the world, which are closely allied to some of the problems I've already mentioned. Development economics within the broader discipline of development studies, if it can be called a discipline, it does have certain institutional locations under that heading, has always enjoyed a certain greater privilege, I would say, greater prestige. And this despite, of course, having within the discipline of economics arguably a relatively low status. Again, for the same reasons, that it's applied, it's viewed as having more muddy materials, being deeply empiricist by nature and so on. Of course, that has its ebbs and flows, but I will put that forward as a broad characterization. And I think within development economics, there are multiple tendencies which are at play, as there are within development studies at large. And you can see certain moments in which some of those tendencies are exemplified to a greater extent, or are present or prevalent to a greater extent, enjoy greater hegemony. Although there are fads and fashions in development, many of them, which is itself a very interesting story of the succession of fads and fashions which have taken place. I think one of the recurrent undercurrents which one can see in the diverse fads and fashions which have emerged over time is a tendency, at least in certain quarters, to embrace what one might call technocratic understandings of the world and supposed solutions. This can have very many dimensions to it. I've mentioned already randomized trials as an example of a method which has enjoyed tremendous attention in recent years. And I would suggest to you that one of the primary reasons for that is that this method has attached to it the attractions of technocracy. The notion that if only we could scientifically discover what works in one place, then we can make it work everywhere. We can roll it out, go to scale, as they say. A wonderful phrase, we can go to scale. Thereby transform the world. Find the little things that work. Since we can't understand the big things, we can at least understand the little things and generalize them. But as I've noted, there are other instances of this, many, many examples, and I would even suggest that you can go into any development debate and find this technocratic modality which is playing a role. There's a wonderful article, which again, through the good offices of Akbar and Arjun and others, I could circulate if you are interested, by a a development economist, Ashwani Seth, which is about the relationship of the British left-wing economist Joan Robinson to India. And as some of you may know, Joan Robinson was very glamorized by the Chinese experiment under Mao. And it is less well known that she was quite critical of the Indian planning and development trajectory. Now, whatever her reasons for being, specific reasons for being glamorized by the Chinese case and critical of the Indian case, there is something broader, I think, to be gleaned from the impressions that she had. Her perception, rightly or wrongly, was that the Chinese were engaged in a more deeply political experiment of trying to transform the social order which they'd inherited from the past and the institutions of their country, so as to bring about a bona fide transformation of the society in a short period of time. Okay. Now, she, of course, had made a number of misjudgments. In particular, she was very keen on the Cultural Revolution, which very few people in China are keen on nowadays. But the essence of the distinction that she made was that she thought that the Chinese were engaged in a political project of trying to really tackle head-on the hierarchies, the inequities, the suboptimal institutional patterns and structures inherited from the past, recognizing that this was a political project which required a kind of mass mobilization to bring about. In India, in contrast, she thought that the people at the helm of the Indian planning and development enterprise, people like P.C. Mahalanobis or later Sukhomoy Chakravarti or others, many of the brilliant young Indian economists, some of whom have become household names today in the West, in Western economics as well, not in the West, but in Western economics, were glamorized by technical tools. And they thought that the route to bring about development in India was to arrive at the right recipe, the right sequencing of steps, for example, or the right optimal tariffs, or some other such thing. They were very interested in turnpike theorems and shadow prices and all that, which is very interesting stuff indeed, but which Joan Robinson thought was more or less useless for attacking the deep-seated inequities and structures in the society. So I think this is another very fascinating example of the two elements in the debate. I don't want to embrace Joan Robinson's view, even retrospectively, and I wouldn't have done it then either, I don't think, about China. But I think there is something interesting in this debate, and what it tells us is that where China might have succeeded in certain aspects of its development strategy by taking a more expressly political view, while at the same time, of course, making great errors, and we know that. I don't want to endorse the totality of their path in any sense. I don't think most of us would wish to do that. India had a different kind of failure, of having an approach which was which gave too little attention to the participatory and democratic foundations of transformation, and too little, perhaps, affirmation of the knowledge of ordinary people, which is necessary in the development process. So even though India had a discourse of community-driven development from the 1950s onward, one could argue that it was never given as serious attention as it ought to have been, and in many respects India maintained a kind of colonial apparatus of governmental relationship with society, something which people like Partho Chatterjee and others have made much hay of in recent years. And the same thing can be said about sub-Saharan Africa. Mahmoud Mamdani has argued this about basically similar thesis about sub-Saharan Africa, that the colonial relationship between state and society has never been changed, and this leads to various kinds of bad consequences, in particular for bad decisions being taken in the development process by not taking advantage of the knowledge of people as ought to have been done. And of course, it's not only an informational issue, much as I would endorse everything which our guru, Professor Joe Stiglitz, has to say about this matter. I endorse everything he has to say. But in addition, on the importance of information, but indeed in his book Whither Socialism, he gestures at the necessity of a participatory democracy in order to make good use of information in public good creation and in governance generally. But going beyond that, or making a, I shouldn't say going beyond that, I should, to the guru, but say making an adjoint point or complementary point, there's also a necessity for participatory and democratic engagement from another perspective, which is that it's the only approach to bringing about decisions on critical matters which can have a degree of legitimacy, be seen to have a degree of legitimacy, and indeed generate a degree of legitimacy on a widespread basis, which is necessary for these decisions to have beneficial consequences over a sustained period of time, and not to be the subjects of ongoing confrontation. So there is an efficiency aspect, if you will. There's an equity aspect. I don't like to separate those, but I will, from the point of view of making a distinction while recognizing these are braided together. And there is a legitimacy aspect, all of which go in the direction of recommending a participatory and democratic role in decision making. You know just as well as I do the big cases, the most famous cases of confrontations over development projects, for instance, concerning large dams. These are quintessential examples, but not the only examples. The world is replete with these examples. It can only be a democratic process of some kind that could possibly lead to a decision about whether or not to build a dam in a particular place, of what scale and in what way, that could have a degree of legitimacy. And it's the failure of democratic institutions to be able to play the role that they ought to play in a number of cases, which has led to these becoming instances of great confrontation. Of course, there are always winners and losers, which is something that, at least in the short run, which is something that development economics tends to gloss over, because mainstream development economists have tended to emphasize the importance of growth in the long run, in bringing about gains for everyone. Well, you all know what John Maynard Keynes said about the long run, namely that in the long run, we're all, what are the exact words here?
We're all alive.
In the long run, we're all dead is the phrase that's usually attributed to him. There may be a precision which we can engage in, but I think that's exactly the point. In the long run, we're all dead. The long run may come too late for many people, if it comes at all. Something that Arjun Jaydev and I have been working on is the question of whether growth, in fact, generates Pareto improvements. And Rahul Lahuti was also in this room at the back. Does growth generate reliably improvements in living standards if you track people who belong to a given quantile of the population over time? If you look at the mean of the first quantile, the mean of the second quantile, and so on, even in income terms or consumption, putting aside other aspects of living standards and well-being, do we see improvements over time for all of the quantiles of the population when there is economic growth taking place? And this elementary question, which you'd think economists would have looked at, given the enthusiasm with which they embrace the concept of a Pareto improvement, is something that they, by and large, have not studied. In fact, we can't find a single paper on this subject. Please alert us if you find one. We would be very grateful. Our finding is that growth does not generate Pareto improvements in the short run in many instances, and maybe not even in the intermediate or long term. So the character of a growth process is very crucial for determining whether or not it brings about benefits for all, even if what we're interested in is income alone. The quality of growth, or whether growth is inclusive, to use a phrase which has been widely used of late. So that cannot be taken for granted. But even apart from that, there are, of course, the many non-economic aspects which are at play when people lose, as well as when they win, due to a public decision, such as the decision to put in place a large dam. And And I would submit to you that the development process always involves a reconfiguration of physical space, political interests. It has social-cultural consequences which are often intangible and diverse. Ravi Kanbur, who spoke here recently, has also written about this in an essay he wrote called "What Are Disagreements? Economic Disagreements? What's it called? What are disagreements about? Or what are disagreements in development about?" Roughly is the title of his piece. So all of these things are at play, and they give rise to conflict. So the blithe conception of the economist that conflict can be avoided because everyone can benefit, even in principle, due to suitable compensation, is not only not the norm, it is almost impossible to find cases where that is, in any pure sense, the case. So we have a deep-seated need for democratic decision-making procedures to enable problem solving and to bring about desired efficiency and equity in that process, but also to command legitimacy. And of course, there are people such as Amartya Sen who would argue that we should fold the concept of democratic legitimacy into our understanding of what development is. And I think that there's a powerful attraction to that, but to some extent that is a taxonomic question. I do tend to agree with him that that's the best way to understand what development is, normatively speaking. And from that point of view, we would, of course, development has simply not taken place if it has not taken place with a degree of democratic legitimacy. And I think this is part of the intrinsically conflictual nature of the development process, which makes it far from bloodless. Thus less susceptible to theorization, but so be it. There are many more things that I could say. I think I should stop though.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
up to you, sir.
Well, no, I think I have I've polemicized enough, and I have said too little of substance with respect to specific debates, though I could go on about that, about the fads and fashions, for instance, the long history of fads and fashions, the Washington Consensus, and its the amusing succession of revisions in the understanding of what works in developing countries, which has come in its stead. The current understanding of what works, which in my view really represents a sort of fragmentation. There's very little consensus about that. But I think we should leave that to discussion.
Yeah,
Thank you so
that's
much.
Very, very rigid and Avanti.
I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more about where you went in Madhya Pradesh. I think I have my guesses as to where you went, to kind of give us a more empirical idea about how you need these different approaches to tackle a given problem, and how, in operational practical terms, what it means in terms of collaborations across disciplines and practitioners. Because I don't think what I'm trying to say doesn't mean that necessarily that people in development studies have to cross disciplines, because often that might not be practically feasible, but so much is collaboration across people located in different disciplines.
Should I answer directly
Yeah.
or collect? Yeah.
As you wish.
I think so. Avanti, in fact, I've been to Andhra Pradesh, so right next door, not Madhya Pradesh, and it's a dryland area. And there are very interesting features of dryland agriculture, which are different from irrigated land, as you know. In the Conference on Agrarian Studies that I went to recently, there was a fascinating graph of these, or table of the subsidies given to different kinds of crops in India. We often think in India agriculture is being highly subsidized, but it's a very regional phenomenon. It's very crop specific. So there are entire zones of the country which are completely left out of any kind of subsidy, and these are the zones which are in many ways hurting because not only do they not receive subsidies in procurement prices, but also, or any kind of official procurement with respect to many crops, but they also have suffered from decline of agrarian investment and so on. And I think this has very much to do with the shift of population from rural to urban areas in many countries. But in India's case, not so much so. There's been actually very gentle urbanization. Still a very large proportion of the population is in rural areas. But it also has to do, more importantly, with the other shift I talked about, which is the shift of value-added generation to non-agricultural activities, which makes it makes the state increasingly, in some sense, less interested in investing in agriculture as an engine of development, because it doesn't see that it needs it as much. When 80% of value added is being created outside of agriculture, then it's less obvious that you have to make agriculture the train engine which pulls everything else along. In fact, it seems like the wrong thing to do. So from the point of view of those who are concerned with the macro aggregates such as growth, the attention has shifted increasingly to, from agriculture to areas other than agriculture, even though a very large proportion of the population still subsists in and depends on agriculture directly or indirectly. And of course, there's another aspect of this, which is public finances, that as public revenues burgeon, as they have in India and a number of other countries, more robust public revenues, due to tax handles which are primarily urban, the state becomes less interested in agriculture from that point of view, but rather views some transfers to the agrarian sector as being useful politically. And I think you can view some of the social welfare orientation of recent governments in India in this light. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, for instance. If you wanted to take a more cynical approach to analyzing it, or let us just say a more politically analytical approach to analyzing what is taking place and what the motivations are for it from the point of view of the political coalitions which are in place. They have new opportunities provided by burgeoning public revenues which don't come from agriculture. They still need votes from the rural sector. And this imbalance is something which is new and which was not perhaps adequately anticipated in earlier theory. I don't know whether or not that answers in any way the first part of your question. I took the opportunity to go off in a different direction as well. But let me say about the second point, that second question you asked regarding understanding of how knowledge, useful knowledge can be generated and put to use. In my view, useful knowledge doesn't come from creating a team. Or useful problem solving isn't necessarily going to come from creating a team with one political scientist, one economist, one agronomist, one social cultural anthropologist. Development organizations are used to doing that. It has some value, certainly it has considerable value, as compared to the modality of approaching the issue just in one lens, whether that of economics or agronomy or anthropology, which is deeply fragmentary kind of knowledge to start with. I think that there has to be much more by way of attention in the process of training and research to creating unified knowledge. And in some sense, this is asking of people a great deal. It's asking that they educate themselves in a great number of things. I think that's the right thing to do in the field of development. I don't think development studies departments should consist only of people who are trained in traditional social science disciplines or scientific disciplines and then ask them how to collaborate, which usually they don't. I think that we need to really create much more of a cadre of people who are steeped in integrated knowledge from the first, which is not to say that there has to be a scientific modality to that. Jeff Sachs created a couple of PhD programs over the years, which were supposedly about integrated development, but they tended to prioritize a very specific understanding of what that would mean, which highlighted the role of what I would call a scientistic approach, natural sciences infused understanding of society and of what matters in development. That has its place, but to give priority to one of those things may miss a great deal of the story. I will quote here one of my favorite examples at the risk of boring Arjun and others who've heard me about this. Max Weber, one of the great social scientists, if we want to use that phrase, of all time, he polemicized against some of the other great professors of the German universities of his time, whom he called Professor Prophets. And this was a derisory term which he chose for them. The Professor Prophets were people whom he thought declaimed from upon high about all sorts of things, okay, just because of their perch, because of the place which had been accorded to them by the society, without necessarily having sufficient knowledge to do that. And he argued in direct contrast that what was needed was the intellectual division of labor. That the social sciences had to, like the natural sciences, even in his time, develop much more specialization in order to learn about the world. And indeed, specialized techniques, methodologies. Well, we have had that, right? Of course, it's an irony that Max Weber was himself a Professor Prophet. Put that to one side. We have had that. We've had that for a century, I would say, roughly, and it has been very successful in generating knowledge. So if you want to know, for instance, about the labor market in Bangalore, you can probably find a number of papers on that, I'm going to guess, without having done the literature search myself, right? Some of which would be quite good, very illuminating, and which will draw on specialized techniques from the field of labor economics or sociology of labor and so forth, and give us some great insight. On the other hand, that knowledge is really no use unless you link it to other forms of understanding. Why would you want to know about the labor market in Bangalore? For some reason, presumably. And so it has to be linked to broader sources of knowledge about the labor market in India, or about the dynamics of employment generation in countries at large, or something else. Whatever it is that drives the question has to drive the pursuit of the relevant specialized knowledge. But moreover, there has to be attention to integrating that specialized knowledge in some way. So to put it very polemically, I would say this. The division of labor has succeeded greatly in creating knowledge. It has also succeeded greatly in destroying knowledge by de-emphasizing the role of integration. Indeed, as most of you know, to publish a paper on a broad question is much more difficult than to publish a paper on a narrow question, typically. It's much harder to put together. In many ways, it's quite a difficult task because it requires a broad literature survey. It may require drawing on and tying together different kinds of knowledge, but it's a low-status activity. And that's entirely wrong.
You see, how many questions are there? What I think we do is take 2 questions at a time. Right at the back, we have a very distinguished visitor today. Why don't you start? Let's take 2 or 3 questions.
Yes, if you would please, yes. Also, just to remind us of your names.
My name is Hari Hegde, and I work for Wipro. I just have a comment because what you stated resonates greatly. And a comment to make and give you an example of why I think we need real collaboration and an integrated approach. Just last week, I was attending sessions here, and these days, the corridor developments have become a fashion. You have Mumbai-Delhi corridor coming up, and there are a couple of other corridors under discussion. So we had this renowned consulting organization, a group of them who came in to discuss and consult on a new corridor. I can't divulge the name here because they yet to sort of bring out the report from Bangalore to another city. And interestingly, it's this consulting organization which will put out, and all that gets considered is certain political issues. There is a subject of a vast tract of grazing land, and how the present chief minister, the connection, all that gets discussed. But when you acquire that piece of land, you're actually affecting the livelihood of people and shifting from one way of, then this whole aspect of giving employment in the industries that come in there, they're so limited, and the entire socio-economic aspects are not considered at all. And So, you know, the question comes in, the application of all this, I'm a layman when it comes to economics, right? But application of all this into these large developmental questions isn't happening in India, nor is there any really well-articulated democratic process. That's all, and it's a deep concern.
Let's just go around. Eva and then Morgan.
Would you think that maybe the kind of focus on a lot of quantitative work and quantitative data rather than on qualitative work has led us to being a bit too optimistic in perceiving development and generally growth, and not just in kind of in the emerging world, developing countries, but also in OECD countries, taking the kind of example of Germany, with a massive number of working poor, but still being kind of portrayed as the one wonderful example of where everything is working great. So if that's the case, do we need a shift, or do we need a fundamental kind of rethinking of our tools, more to, I don't know, dualist, or back to kind of dualist models and more structural thinking? And in fact, are you optimistic about us as a profession getting there at some point?
Take one more question.
Maybe also a broad question. I'm wondering if the idea of democratic participation, which I certainly don't disagree with, but if it's on a practical level, it often becomes another box to tick off, and how if you see that danger of it becoming almost like a assumed structure, so maybe not democratic participation as a concept, but then as a sort of last minute thing within the development process to justify actions.
Thank you for that. So I completely agree with Mr. Hegde. I think that that indeed, India provides an interesting example, though this is a broader phenomenon in a number of countries, that on the one hand there's a tremendous impatience on the part of various groups and people, understandably, for certain things to be done. The discourse in India for the last number of years, a dominant discourse in the newspapers, in the media, has been that not enough is being done. There's inaction. The reforms have moved too slowly. There's a wonderful and rather amusing metaphor which has some sense to it, but I think it's not fully thought out by the people involved, which is that reforms are like a bicycle, and if you stop pedaling, then you will fall down. Tyranny of a metaphor, again, of a bad metaphor, but there's certainly that idea that has been very influential, and in many ways understandably so. Because there is a bona fide aspiration of people for better living standards and opportunities. I've already mentioned the tremendous failure in terms of generating employment, not here, but at large in the society, and that needs attention in various respects. But one of the things that's happening as a consequence is that corporate driven understandings of what is desirable and how to do it have become very prevalent, even in the democratic processes. We can see a number of instances of this where particular chief ministers have become very, very close to particular corporate-driven conceptions of what is desirable. And of course, that hasn't always worked. There's been a backlash. So for instance, in the neighboring state I mentioned, Andhra Pradesh, there was a chief minister, Chandrababu Naidu, who was a darling of the New York Times and Davos and so on, because he basically subscribed to a version of what one might call a new liberal economic principles. And he was viewed as making tough decisions and so on. Trouble was, he was not popular enough to be re-elected, because it's not popular to tell people that they must pay the cost of electricity. It's much more popular to tell people that electricity will be provided to them free of charge, whether or not you have the electricity. And I'm not saying that that's a bad policy intrinsically, but indeed, the chief minister who succeeded him had such a policy of providing free electricity and a number of other things, and was vastly more popular. So the requirements of democratic legitimacy may diverge very sharply from the requirements of a corporate-led development process, but a corporate-led development process may also, in some instances, be able to deliver certain things, because in a world of globalized capitalism, you might have to ride the tiger in order to get somewhere. And I think this is some of the, well, there's a genuine tension here, but it's just one sentence, then I'll turn it back to you. I think it's the failure, to agree with what you said, the failure of democratic institutions, even in a supposedly democratic country like India, to be sufficiently democratic to enable adequate scrutiny of such proposals before they happen, and not just scrutiny, because we shouldn't just think of this as being about, this process as being about checks, but involving people so as to make the process one which really furthers their genuine interests. I think this is a very serious problem, this hollowness in the nature of democracy. And this is an issue which is being discussed today in India and in other countries very centrally. It has as one of its manifestations the anti-corruption discourse. But this need to reinvent institutions is at the fore. Yes.
I just needed to clarify when I mentioned the chief minister. I was referring to the chief minister coming from a particular community, yes, and the political implications of this, because this discussion the entire team had with me. So it was not essentially a corporate-driven development strategy, but they were seeking opinions from us. And it was very narrow in terms of whether we will invest or not. And only a few stakeholders coming in, that's it.
Yes.
And so that's the limitation of the entire large developmental program. That's
Absolutely.
More
Absolutely.
questions?
But let me just say one more word about that. I think that we need to have a less conflictual approach in regard to many of these things. Why did Scandinavian social democracy succeed? The unions bought in. There was a compact between the representative of workers and capital. And very often, I think, in India, you see a lot of squandered opportunities in this regard, which I think could take place. I mean, I don't think the special economic zones which have been declared in India on the Chinese model are all failures, for instance, or need to be, but you don't see this kind of collaboration, which requires bringing people to the table, not just in closed rooms, but wider processes.
Martin, Jacob.
Sorry, I didn't answer the other two questions at all.
Oh, sorry.
I don't have to. I'm so sorry. So Eva, very quickly, quantitative versus qualitative. Well, yes and no. You know, Joe Stiglitz, of course, was one of the participants, members, was the co-chair, in fact, co-chair of the Sarkozy appointed commission on living standards. And I think that commission came up with a very interesting proposal, which is to have what they called a dashboard, which allowed one simultaneously to monitor a number of different features of quality of life which are of interest. And some of those may have a quantitative character, some may not. If every one of us in this room knew the number of particulates in the air at on a particular day or week or month, I think that would make a difference to the attention to air pollution in a city such as this. That's a number. It's not it's a way of capturing something qualitative, of course. So I think that the fundamental distinction cannot be between the quantitative and qualitative, but between multi-dimensionality and unidimensionality. And I think that the dashboard approach is an important proposal in that regard. And I think that growth fetishism is something that has to be combated. But there might be more than one way to do that. On the question, but you also mentioned, you suggested there might be a need to go back to a more dualistic or structural way of thinking. You know, I think this is one of the difficulties we have, that dualistic ways of thinking are helpful, but they're also misleading. So I used the phrase surplus labor earlier, but very much in quotation marks, because one of the things that we have understood is that the distinction is not as straightforward as was once believed between the two sides of the dualism in development discussions of this sort. Morgan, box ticking in democracy. Yes, absolutely. This is the problem. I mean, that it's very easy to co-opt language. World Bank has a very long and wonderful history of that. It's not the only institution which has done that. It's very easy to do it, and it's very easy to embrace a shallow rather than a deep understanding of what development requires. And I think that that's why you need to have a political movement which recognizes the necessity of public participation in one way or another, and not simply to have top-down understandings of what matters. Again, at the conference I attended, there was a very interesting panel on Kerala's experiment with democratic decentralization, which has gone much deeper than the experiment in certain other Indian states, because there's been a commitment to that, not just on the part of the left front government, LDF government, which includes communist parties, but also the other major grouping of parties, the UDF. Of course, you could argue it's been forced to respond, but nevertheless, there's a much deeper commitment than in many other parts of India. And so, if one asks the question, could local democracy matter? Does it make a difference? Well, probably yes, it could make a tremendous difference. Kerala is a partial example of that, despite its imperfections. But what it requires is a commitment to go beyond words. And how can one bring that about? That's your next task.
Martin, Jacob, and Suleva, in that order. This is going on.
So, two clarification questions. The first on your statement that development should be an empirical subject, not theoretical subject. From your explanation, what I understood is that...
Can you speak loudly?
Yeah, sure. Yes, sure. So the first question is about your statement according to which development should be an empirical subject and not a theoretical subject. From your explanation, what I understood was that it wasn't a critic to theory, but a critic to empirical analysis at the cross-section level, because that doesn't take into account the specificities that we observe at the case level. So, is that correct that the critic is at the cross-section empirical analysis instead of theory? And the second question is about your remarks on desirable structural transformations. What is the metric that we should use for judging what is a desirable structural transformation?
I had the same exact question. Sorry.
The second one.
The first one, actually.
Okay.
Sorry.
My question has to do with a part in your talk where you talked about economic growth. And it's like, the question is, what's your take on unemployment-led economic growth? Like, for example, there are a few countries right now who are registering economic growth annually, but their level of unemployment is increasing as well. So what's your take on unemployment-led economic growth?
Any more questions? You have to finish it. Yes, I'm there.
Thank you. I just wanted to tag on to Martin's question, where you talked about sort of like anecdotal evidence, empirical knowledge versus experiments, and I just wanted to question whether it's really whether it's really about these two things, or if we're just not good enough yet in terms of our ability to analyze complex systems to understand sort of like, to understand how development or how the world works. I mean, I understand that context matters, but I've actually come from a sort of like a public health school that very much was sort of postmodern institution that favored qualitative science much more over quantitative science, and then working with development and health projects, I realized the importance of having metrics to optimize resource allocations. Anyways, I would love to have a longer discussion, but basically I just wanted to challenge the notion that the RCTs are so bad, but rather that it's maybe a question that we just don't have the ability to analyze complex systems computationally. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We need to probably down by 3 or 4 minutes or something.
I don't want to keep everyone from
No, it's
coffee.
okay. We'll keep 5 minutes of our coffee time.
Even substandard coffee. Akbar and I were discussing. I'm sorry, Mr. Hegde. The coffee in South India is a very high quality, but not necessarily in the Wipro cafeteria. But much as we have deeply appreciated your hospitality, all respects. No, indeed. So it's been, these are all very interesting and important questions. I think on the first question, whether the distinction I'm making is just between the cross-sectional analysis and case analysis. No, I'm not making merely a distinction of that nature. I think it is true that cross-sectional, especially cross-country analysis operating at a very high level of aggregation is likely to miss a great deal. I remember when I was a PhD student, Akbar will laugh at this because it situates me as also being young compared to him and Jose Antonio and others. But in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, cross-country regression analysis was the fad. Right? Everybody was doing it. If you weren't doing it, then you were missing the boat. And then very quickly we learned that it was out of fashion. I learned it was out of fashion. My friend Francisco Rodriguez, who follows these things, told me one fine day, it's out of fashion. Nowadays you can't publish a paper anymore with cross-country analysis. Though we saw one paper about that here, interestingly. But by and large, it went out of fashion. Why? Well, I never quite got that a clear answer on that from economists. I've been asking around. But the answer that I could get to the best of my knowledge is along the following lines. Cross-country regression results are not sufficiently robust. Too much depends on the specification. Too much depends on the data set. There are very few conclusions which survive variation in those two things. And moreover, we can't understand very much by way of the causal processes which link the right-hand side to the left-hand side variables. Therefore, we have decided to move on. And then there arose a fad, methodological fad for something, brief fad, something called analytical narratives, which I think of somewhat more highly. People like Danny Roderick and even Robert Bates and others wrote about this, arguing that we need, Arvind Subramanian, we need to go deeper into individual cases and combine that with our knowledge of what is happening around the world, derived from cross-country analysis through regressions and other means, to make sense of the causal processes which are at play. I think that's a bit of an improvement. Nevertheless, and certainly it involved a recognition of the importance of history and of institutional analysis and so forth. But I think even that perhaps was a little bit partial because by and large the practitioners still subscribed to the idea that there was some set of causal mechanics which could be identified around the world. Then, of course, there was Danny Roderick Mark II or Mark III, which took the point of view quite, I think, reasonably and compellingly even, that everything was truly local. There was localized problem solving in individual countries, and we had to understand what constraints were binding in specific countries in order to make sense of what were the appropriate policies in those countries and so forth. And I think all of that has constituted an evolution in terms of how we understand what we can learn from country-based comparisons. And in particular, we have understood that we need to go more deeply into country analysis. Of course, this will not, again, surprise the old-timers because they know that in the 1970s there was a similar debate. It's very amusing that Jagdish Bhagwati, for example, who's a great votary of free trade, is also opposed to, has been for many years opposed to cross-country regression analysis as a way of defending free trade. And he always cites a group of country studies which were done by the NBER in the early 1970s on the impact of trade, now obscure country studies. So his view is that we can only really understand what is the impact of something like trade policy through country-based case studies. So there is this coalescence there. Now, my own view, I'm sorry I'm taking much too long, is that the problem that I'm pointing to, however, is not one which is specific to a given level of analysis. It applies at every level of analysis. So there's a kaleidoscopic character to these problems. At every level of analysis, you need everything. Study everything at every level, and link everything. And if that doesn't lead to parsimony, so what? If it leads to understanding. So I'm not making an argument for looking at cases and not at comparisons, or looking at cases at one level and not at another level. I'm making an argument for awareness of interconnections and relevant specificities. What is the metric by which successful transformation should be determined? Well, I don't have a pat answer to that except to say that sometimes one can get somewhere by at least seeing what's not a good metric. one of the famous slogans in Indian philosophy is not this, not this, not this. So sometimes one can make progress by denying the validity of certain concepts which would otherwise harmonize us as a guide. So I think recognizing that growth fetishism can lead to error is an example of an approach to progress of such a kind. That doesn't mean that it's straightforward to say what should enter the dashboard. But that there should be a dashboard which goes beyond economic output is very clearly the case. I mentioned the phrase maldevelopment earlier. I think, personally, there's something important to be learned from the critics of development. If we ask the question, has development around the world been a success or a failure, it's not an easy question to answer. Right? Amartya Sen has argued powerfully, influentially, in many ways convincingly, that development as a process which expands people's freedom has been a real process around the world. And I think, again, one has to be very respectful of that viewpoint. On the other hand, there is evidence of maldevelopment. Nigeria is an interesting case. It shows up very clearly in the data I was looking at the other day. Just like India, very little employment generation. So it's all push, people going from the rural areas to the cities, tremendous urbanization. Entering this second part of the service sector I mentioned, basically trying to survive in the cities. This was a phenomenon Harrison Todaro mentioned way back in looking at Kenya in the late 1960s. So a lot of push, not so much pull, not so much opportunity in the cities. So if you look at what's actually happening in terms of people's real living standards, yes, improvement in living standards in certain ways. When you're in the city, you're closer to a hospital, you're closer to a school, you might have more calorie intake typically, but it's hard to look at Lagos and say this is a picture of development success. Okay, and if you don't know enough about Lagos to conclude that, then read about it, and you'll find that I think Lagos is not exceptional, but it's an example of that. Okay, and I think that's partly my answer to your question on, I think you used the phrase employment-led economic growth. I think one could maybe make a distinction between two questions. One is whether the growth process is generative of employment and more generally of livelihoods, because employment is only one form that livelihood, sustenance, and generation takes. And the question of whether a strategy should be employment-led or wage-led, which is to say that causally it should be biased toward that as a way of generating other kinds of goods. I think both could be important. Finally, empirical knowledge versus experience. Yes, are we just not good enough yet? Are calculational tools too weak? Do we need all sorts of information in order to optimize resource allocation? Well, basically, I don't believe that. I think that this is a recurrent trope in scientific understandings of the development process, and it's false, fundamentally. I don't believe there's been that much progress in the social sciences. This is my own personal view. And I also think there are deep-seated reasons for that, fundamentally to do with the nature of human agency itself, which continually disrupts. You want a postmodern term, there it is. Any effort to discipline, there's another postmodern term. The unruly, another postmodern term. Social reality, though I'm not a postmodernist. Right? Through simplistic, scientific frames. It will always be disrupted by what? By human agency, individual and collective, which has as its very nature the ability to create, recreate, change institutions, social settings, political contexts, and those empirical regularities which survive that will be very few and far between. Are very few and far between. So that's why social science is not a permanent discipline. It has no permanent set of principles which can ever apply. This is why it was Max Planck who said, when asked why he didn't study social sciences, said because it's too difficult. So let me end there.
Have a 20-minute coffee break.